My name is Dave Nave. Russell Ackoff brought new insights into managing the interactions between the parts of a company rather than managing the behavior of each part individually. He called this approach systems thinking, and his insights are a tremendous contribution to business and society. On behalf of the Deming Cooperative, we are pleased to make these videos available to you for your continued learning.
Good morning. Good morning. If you listen to introductions, you tend to get an inflated concept of yourself. Fortunately, if you're a professor, something is happening to you all the time that balances off. For example, I was invited to give a lecture recently to a group of undergraduates at the Wharton School. And after the lecture, I was walking down the hall when one of the students caught up with me. He said, "Hey, professor." He said, "I just read your latest book." He said, "It's great. It contains a lot more than you know." Well, I had to think about that a little bit as to who the you was. And then he said, "Do you mind if I ask you a personal question?" I said, "No." He said, "How old are you?" At the time, I said 85. "Wow," he said, "you're old." Well, I couldn't deny it, so we took a couple more steps. He said, "When did you start teaching?" I said, "September of 1941. "Wow," he said, "you mean to say you've been teaching more than 60 years? I said, "Yeah." He paused, he said, "What was the last time you taught a course in a subject which existed when you were a student?" Now that's a great question. I had never thought of that. So I had to think, and finally I said, "It was September of 1951. He said, "You mean to say that everything you've taught for the last 50 years, you had to learn and nobody taught you?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You must be a pretty good learner." Well, I modestly agreed. Then he said, "What a shame you're not that good a teacher." No. So that's what balances out after introductions, when you get the student's opinion. Today's sermon is based on an observation which was printed about 10 years ago in the New York Times by one of its regular columnists, Leslie Gelb, and that's what's up here on the board. He's not the only one who has seen that the current transformation our culture is going through constitutes a change of age. Most people don't realize how fundamental a change of age is. It doesn't occur very often. The last real change of age was the Renaissance, and that's 400 years ago. And although we know that there's a change of age occurring, we haven't yet settled on a name. I discovered something recently which surprised me and was very edifying. Do you know when the word Renaissance was first applied to the period 1,400 years ago? It was the middle of the 19th century. It was 200 years after the Renaissance that it got a name that everybody agreed to. So right now there are a lot of different names. The information age, Wiener's name, or Drucker called it the age of uncertainty. Rifkin calls it the age of access. I publish it as the systems age for reasons I'll try to make clear, and so on. We haven't settled on a name yet. Nevertheless, the description of its essential characteristics are at least complementary. The main characteristic of a change of age is the way of thinking which characterizes the age. And the one who's best caught the significance of that fact was Einstein in this beautifully simple little statement: "You can't solve the problems created by our current pattern of thought using our current pattern of thought." Understanding this is required to understand what the transformation is about. The interesting thing about this quote is I've literally shown it to thousands of executives, and I always ask them, is there anybody who disagrees with this? And nobody ever disagrees with it. And then I ask them what it means, and they haven't the foggiest idea. It's easy to agree with something you don't understand. And yet I'm going to argue that this is the most important single thing a manager can understand, because without it, he's in trouble. Now, imagine how an executive would respond to that kind of statement. Essentially, what the hell are you talking about? I mean, here we are in the strongest economy in the world, doing extremely well again. What do you mean we're threatened if we don't understand this? Well, it's amazing how little people know about the American economy. Do you know that we have to create 23 new corporations every year to have one that will survive the first year? We have 22 failures for every success in 1 year. Do you know what the average life of an American corporation is? 11 and a half years. Over 50% of the corporations in the Fortune 500 list 25 years ago no longer exist. The Dow Index, which is the stock price of the blue chips, contains only one of its original corporations in the index today, General Electric. All the others have disappeared. The number of bankruptcies in the United States has increased exponentially every year for the last 10 years. And it goes on and on. You see, the nature of our economy and its strength is not well understood. I had a professor who did understand it. He once asked the class, what's the evidence that we have the strongest economy in the world? And of course, all of our smart-ass students knew the answer to that. GNP per capita, consumption rates, standard of living, all the usual things. He kept saying, no, no, no. Finally, we gave up and asked him. He said, there's no other economy in the world that could survive as much inefficiency as ours. Now, that turns out to be a wonderful criterion because it's true, but it's also hopeful, it's optimistic. Because imagine, if instead of 22 failures for every success, suppose we only had 15. Or suppose instead of 50% of the corporations disappearing every 25 years, only half of that number did. The opportunities for improvement are incredible. And that's what we're here to talk about. Because although it's conceivable that organizations may survive, they are not going to thrive until managers understand the nature of the shift in the way we think. Now, the traditional way of thinking is called analysis. That's not surprising. And what I'm going to take you through is the following argument. Analysis, which became synonymous with thought in the Western world, in the 1950s, for the first time, began to create paradoxes that could not be solved. And it became apparent that we needed another way of thinking. That way of thinking was developed. Without that way of thinking and the understanding that it produced, organizations will not thrive, and I would guess they won't even survive in this century. Now, I've got to prove all that. Those are simply assertions. So first we want to see what analysis is and what's the problems that it got us into. Analysis emerged during the Renaissance when science emerged. During the medieval period, curiosity was considered to be a sin in one of the encyclicals of the church, because the church said you shouldn't spend time worrying about this life, you should be worrying about afterlife. Living this life in such a way as to get entry into paradise where you would spend unlimited time. You see, expected life during the medieval period was only 27 years. 47% of the children born never survived childhood. The average person never traveled out of the village in which they were born. They never ate 3 meals a day. They lived in abject poverty. And so the fundamental question people asked during this period was, what's the purpose of life? And it was the church, the only institution of significance in the Western world, which gave the answer. It's preparatory for death. That's its significance. You ever look at the art of the medieval period? What's it about? You know, all you have is God and the angels and saints and saintesses floating around in the clouds, and little cherubs, you know, and taking care of them. The great literature is things like Dante's Inferno and Milton's Paradise Gained and Paradise Lost. It's all about afterlife, spiritual life. But the Renaissance produced a change of age because of the Crusades. When the first crusade was led by Peter the Hermit across the face of Europe, about 40,000 men saw cultures that differed from the village from which they came. And they got curious. Why do these people live differently than we do? What's the nature of those differences? How did they arise? And out of this came a movement that you all learned about in school called the New Humanism. It was a new interest in man and his behavior. And with that came an interest in his environment, and that gave rise to science. You can't have science without curiosity, and you can't have curiosity with a method of inquiry. And the method of inquiry that was adopted is the one that comes absolutely naturally to us. You can see it in a child, even today. If you take a child, not an infant, but a child, say, between 2 and 5 years old, give them an object they've never seen before, a toy, a radio, a clock, and leave them alone with it. And they want to find out what it is. What do? They go through 3 steps. First, you take it apart. Then you try to understand the behavior of each of the parts taken separately. And then you try to assemble that understanding into an understanding of the whole. That's the analytical process. Now, analysis became synonymous with thought in the Western world. So if you two had a problem and I ask you, what did you do about it? You say, I thought about it. I ask you, what did you do about it? You say, I analyzed it. And I ask you, what's the difference in what they did? You'd have trouble telling me, because analysis was thinking, and still is, in most of the Western world. All of our institutions are organized analytically. If you go to a business school to study business, you don't take courses in Business 1, Business 2, Business 3. What does the business school do to business? It takes it apart. And so you study production and marketing, finance and personnel. And the hope is that after you've studied all the parts, you'll be able to aggregate them into an understanding of the whole. That's the analytical process. Government's organized the same way. It divides itself into transportation, health, welfare, crime, and so on. Tries to manage each one, and then assemble an understanding of each of them into an understanding of the whole. Well, we started to get into some problems. How many of you have ever been to England? Good. You know that the British drive on the wrong side of the road. Do you know why? Well, suppose I gave you a bunch of British automobiles and you analyze them. You think it would tell you why the British drive on the left instead of the right? Would taking them apart answer that question? Of course not. In the United States, the automobile developed between World War I and World War II was a 6-passenger car. Why? Why wasn't it 8, 5, 1, 15? Why 6? Do you think taking cars apart will tell you why it was 6? Let's take a simple one. All the cars developed in the United States had the motor in front. It wasn't until the Volkswagen came along and put a motor in the back that we realized it was possible. Why was the motor put on front? Do you think taking a car apart will tell you that? It will tell you that it is in the front. It won't tell you why it's in front. What we began to recognize is that there are a set of phenomena which cannot be understood by analyzing them. What you can learn by analyzing them is how they work. Know-how, that's knowledge. It is not understanding. And it wasn't until 1950s that the Western world began to understand the difference between knowledge and understanding. Knowledge provides answers to how-to questions. Understanding provides answers to why questions. So if you ask, where is San Francisco relative to Los Angeles? You tell me whatever it is, 320 miles to the north. That's information because it's descriptive. If I say, how do I get there in the car, and you tell me how to drive, what routes to take, that's instruction. How to, that's knowledge. You say, why the hell do you want to go to San Francisco? That's not knowledge. You want reasons or an explanation. And so we began to recognize that analysis could not yield understanding of something called a system. And that was a major development in our comprehension of reality. Well, let's see why. In order to understand this, we have to understand what a system is. A system is a whole. Notice that's spelled with a W. That's defined by its function in a larger system of which it's a part. Every system is defined by its role or function in a larger system. So if you take a simple system like the automobile, it's a mechanical system, how do you define it? Well, it's an instrument for carrying people from one place to another under their control in privacy on land. You describe its function. What's a laptop computer? You don't tell me how it works. You tell me what it does, its function. When you talk about the function of something, it's always seen as a part of a larger whole. And that created a hell of a problem for Sir Isaac Newton. You see, Newton, following Descartes, the French philosopher, said the universe is a system. In fact, Newton went beyond Descartes. He said the universe is a hermetically sealed clock. Now, he didn't say it was like a hermetically sealed clock. He said it is a hermetically sealed clock. The ultimate method of telling time is the movement of the planets. That's obvious. A clock is a mechanism that operates with a regularity dictated by its internal structure and the causal laws of nature, which Newton thought he had formulated in his 3 laws of motion. The interesting part is he said it was hermetically sealed. What did that mean? What's a hermetically sealed clock?
Not influenced by the outside.
It's a closed system. It has no environment. Well, that's not surprising because the universe contains everything. There can't be anything outside of it. Then how can it be part of a larger system, which it must be if it's a system? See, that's a paradox that you or I really would have been stumped on, but not Newton. He came up with a solution that was accepted by every institution in the Western world. The universe is a machine created by God to do his work. So you see, he gave it a function in a larger system, deity. Now, in order to perform its function, every system has at least 2 essential parts. An essential part of a system is a part without which it can't perform its defining function. So in an automobile, a motor is essential because it can't carry it from one place to another without a motor. The battery, the fuel pump, the windshield wiper isn't, the cigarette lighter isn't, the rug isn't, the door handle isn't, because it can perform its defining function without those things. See, you have an essential property, life, and you can't live without a heart, without a brain, without lungs. Those are essential, but your fingers aren't. In fact, your hand isn't essential. Neither is your arm. In fact, you can live without arms or legs. There are people who do. They're not essential, but you can't live without a brain. Now, the essential parts of a system have to satisfy 3 conditions. And these conditions are critical for understanding what a system is and understanding the paradox that became apparent in the 1950s. Each part of a system can affect its behavior or its properties of the whole. Now, I told this to a group of doctors a while back, and one of them immediately objected. He said, there's one part of the body that's not known to have any effect on it at all. Now, I've heard this hundreds of times, but I didn't want to offend him, so I pretended to hear it for the first time. I said, there is? What is it? And with a good deal of pride, he told me what the part was that has no effect on the whole. What is it? What's it called? Appendix, right. What does the word appendix mean? Means added on or attached to. It's not a part. You see, if they ever find a function for the appendix, they have to change its name. Right? The appendix of a report's not a part of the report, it's what's added on to justify the expense. But it's an add-on, it's not a part. Every essential part of a system must be able to affect its performance, its properties. But the way it does it always depends on at least one other part. Now we can say that second condition in several ways. No essential part of a system has an independent effect on the whole. The essential parts of a system form a connected set. If you take any two, you take the fuel pump and the motor of a car, you'll find a path between them, however indirect. Take the brain and the stomach, you'll find a path between them because they interact. No essential part has an independent effect on the whole. How it affects you depends on what other parts are doing. The heart depends on the lungs. It requires oxygen. But the lungs won't operate without signals from the brain. But it turns out the brain also needs oxygen. But it also needs blood, which depends on the heart. So the parts are all interconnected. And so the essential parts of a system form what the logician calls a connected set. And then finally, if you take the parts of a system and group them into subsystems, for example, in the human being, you've got the nervous system, the metabolic system, the motor subsystem. These are all subsystems, collections of essential parts. In the automobile, you've got what's called the drivetrain, the electrical system, the braking system, the steering system. They're all subsystems. Each subsystem can affect the behavior or properties of the whole, just like the parts, and none of them has an independent effect on the whole. So your motor system depends on a nervous system. Without a nervous system, you can't move. But you can't have a nervous system without a motor system. The parts, these subsystems are interdependent as well. And therefore, it follows from its definition that no part of a system has the properties that the system has. See, no part of an automobile can carry you from one place to another. The body can't, the wheels can't, the axle can't. None of the parts can do what the automobile as a whole does. You have an incredible property, life, and amazingly, no part of you lives. Life is a product of the interaction of your parts, just like the automobile's capacity to move you derives out of the way its parts interact and not on how they act taken separately. And therefore, when you take a system apart, it loses all of its essential properties because its essential properties derive out of the interactions of its parts. So if I brought an automobile in here and disassembled it but kept every part in the room, I do not have an automobile because no system is the sum of its parts, like we sometimes say. It is the product of their interactions. And therefore, when we take it apart, it loses all of its essential properties, and so do its parts. See, an automobile can't move without a motor, obviously. But when you take the motor out of the automobile, what can it move? Not a damn thing. Can't even move itself, it just sits there. The steering wheel determines the direction of the car, but take it off the car and put it on a table, it doesn't steer anything. You can't think without a brain. But if the surgeon removes your brain and puts it on a table, it doesn't sit there and think. Because you as a whole do the thinking. The brain is essential, but the brain doesn't think. And therefore, when a system is taken apart, the whole loses all of its defining properties, and so do the parts. And now you can see why a business school education is absolute nonsense. Because what do you study in a business school? You study the parts taken separately: production, marketing, finance, personnel, and so on. The only thing important about marketing is how it interacts with production and finance and personnel. But if a marketing professor in a business school begins to talk about interactions, he's considered to be disloyal to his nation, marketing. He's got to talk about marketing as an independent subject. And as an independent subject, it loses all of its essential properties. And so it's not surprising that students come out of a business school and don't know a damn thing about a business. The only thing they get of value is a ticket to a job where they can learn something about management. It is currently estimated that 95% of what a student, 95% of what a manager uses, he learned on the job, not in school. But school's a good place to grow up and have some fun and to get the ticket to the place that will ultimately give you an opportunity to learn about management. Now, let's go back to the issue. When you analyze a system, the first step is to take it apart. And therefore, a system cannot be understood using analysis. We need a different way of thinking. And that was the discovery in the 1950s as a result of the appearance of a book written by a German biologist, Ludwig von Bertalanffy, who had migrated from Germany to Canada, where he collected a group of his papers and published them in English for the first time in a book that's not particularly important. What is important is the concept on which the book focused. The book was called General Systems Theory. It was because of the attention called to the concept of a system that we recognized that analysis could only yield knowledge of a system, tell you how it works. You take an automobile apart, it'll tell you how it works, but it won't tell you why the motor's in the front. Why is the motor in the front of an automobile? Well, you all know. What was it originally called? What was the automobile called when it was first produced? Horseless carriage. Where was the horse? What's the motor? It's a replacement of the horse. How do you measure the strength of a motor? Horsepower, of course. Why was the car a 6-passenger vehicle?
Average size of the family.
The average family was 5.6, and the car was designed to carry the average family. Why is it getting smaller? Average family today is 3.2. You don't need a 6-passenger car for it anymore, for the average family. Why did the British drive on the left? Now that's an interesting one. You can't tell by taking British cars apart. It turns out during the medieval period, the principal form of transportation in England, because remember, we had Indians during the medieval period. We didn't have people here, right? What was the principal form of transportation in the medieval period? Horse, right. What side do you mount a horse on? From the left. Now, if you're on a road with a horse that you want to mount and you want to keep out of traffic, which side of the road would you have the horse when you want to mount him so you're not hit by traffic? The left. And so they rode on the left. And the carts followed the horses. Now, why do we drive on the right? Well, when the British first came to this country, the Pilgrims and the others, they drove on the left. And they drove in carts, and the carts developed a little canvas thing up on top so that when it rained, they could keep dry. But there was a problem. The brake on a cart was usually outside the cart on the right-hand side that you pulled back to put a shoe against the wheel so that when you stopped, the cart wouldn't move. And one day in the rain, the story goes, a young man had to put the brake on. He got his arm all wet. He said, that's stupid. Why don't I move the brake inside the cart? So he pulled the brake and moved it to the middle of his cart. But now he had a new problem. He had to pull the brake on with his left hand. Now you may not recall, but during the medieval period, left-handedness was considered to be a possession by the devil. And so left arms were not developed. In fact, even when I was young as a student, you were not allowed to write with your left hand in school. You had to write with your right hand regardless, because left-handedness was considered to be an aberration. And so that lever arm, the brake, was hard to pull with the left arm. He wanted to arrange so you could do it with your right arm. Therefore, how did he solve that problem? He moved the driver over to the left so he could use his right arm. So now he's in a cart with the brake in the middle of the cart, pulled on by the right arm, with a driver sitting on the left, but he had a new problem. What was it? He can't see around the cart in front of him. If you ever try to drive an American automobile in England, you can understand that problem, because if you don't have a passenger, You can't pass because you can't see around the car in front of you. How did he solve that problem? Moving the cart to the right. And so we wound up driving on the right, all because the guy started by not wanting to get his arm wet. It's in the functioning of a system that you get to understand its properties and its behavior. And that requires synthetic thinking. Synthetic thinking is a three-step process, just like analysis, but the exact contradictory. Step by step, it's the contradictory. In the first step of analysis, you take the thing you want to understand as a whole, which you take apart. In the first step of synthesis, you take the thing you want to understand as a part of a larger whole. So instead of going down to parts, you're going up to a containing whole. If I want to understand an automobile, it's part of the transportation system. If I want to understand the business school, it's part of a university. Universities are part of the educational system. You start by identifying a containing whole. In the second step of analysis, you try to understand the behavior of the parts taken separately. In the second step of synthesis, you try to understand the behavior of the containing whole. What does the transportation system do? What does the educational system do? What does the economy do if I want to understand a corporation? In the third step of analysis, you try to aggregate the understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. In the third step of synthesis, you disaggregate the understanding of the containing system into identifying the role or function of the thing that you want to understand in the whole which contains it. And so we understand an automobile by identifying its function in the transportation system. You understand the university by identifying its function in the educational system. Okay? So the defining characteristics of a system depend on how its parts interact and not on how they act taken separately. And this takes us to the first major consequence of systems thinking. Runs completely contrary to the fundamental doctrine on which contemporary management in the Western world operates and all business schools operate. The assumption is that when you improve the performance of the parts taken separately, you improve the performance of the whole. And that's absolutely false. Absolutely false. That's why we have 22 failures for every success. Because we try to improve the parts taken separately. And you can destroy a system by making the parts behave better. Managers don't understand that. There's only one profession that does. Now, before I show you the profession and how it uses this knowledge, I have to prove to you in one way or another that when you improve the parts, you do not necessarily improve the system. And you may, in fact, destroy it. There is a formal proof in system science that was developed a couple years ago. It's very complex. It involves advanced mathematics, and I'm not going to take you through it because, among other reasons, I don't remember it. But we don't have to. We can do it with an example. I'm going to ask you to run an experiment, and you can do it sitting where you are. You can do the whole thing in your head. According to the ultimate source of all knowledge in the United States, the New York Times, there are 457 different automobiles available in the United States. That was a couple years ago. It's probably a little higher than that now. Suppose we bought one of each and brought them into a big garage. Okay, you got the picture? 457 different automobiles in the garage. Now we hire 100 of the best automotive engineers in the world and bring them to that garage. Give them the following problem. Which of these cars has the best motor? Well, they run a series of tests and they'll eventually reach consensus, and my guess would be that it's the Rolls-Royce that has the best motor. So I'll make a note of that. Motor, Rolls-Royce. Okay, let's take the transmission next. Well, perhaps a Mercedes turns out to have the best transmission. Try the fuel pump. Maybe the Lincoln has the best fuel pump. One by one, you take every essential part of an automobile and find out which car has the best one. When that list is complete, you now know for each essential part of an automobile which the best one is. Remove the best parts from each of the cars of which it's a part. We're going to take the motor out of the Rolls-Royce, the transmission out of the Mercedes. We're going to take the fuel pump out of the Lincoln, and so on. And then tell those 100 engineers to put them together into the best possible automobile. Because for the first time now, we'll have an automobile that consists of only the best available parts. Do you get the best automobile? Of course not. Got all the best parts? In fact, there's a more fundamental question. Do you get an automobile? You don't even get an automobile. Why not? Perfectly obvious. The parts don't fit. The performance of a system depends on how the parts fit together, not on how they perform taken separately. How do they perform collectively? How do they interact? Determines the performance of the whole. And therefore, when you improve the performance of the parts taken separately, you may destroy the way they interact with other parts. And this becomes apparent. Take a Hyundai. Okay, it's a relatively inexpensive car. According to Consumer Reports, a few years ago, it was underpowered. The motor wasn't strong enough. Well, why don't we put a Rolls-Royce motor in a Hyundai? Do you get a better car? We can't get it in. But if you could, would it be a better car? It would not. Why? Because the other parts are not designed to work with the Rolls-Royce motor. They would not work together well. And so by improving the performance of a part, you can destroy the system. Now, the only profession that understands all this is the architect. And you've got to look at the way an architect works, because a building is a very interesting system. I used to be an architect at one point before I was saved. And when I was working in an architect's office one day, a family came in and told me they had bought a lot out in the country, and they were assigned to me. The first thing we did is went out and looked at the lot, which was a beautiful hilly lot in a heavily wooded area. It was 2.5 acres with a stream running through it and a ravine. It was really a beauty. He said, we want to build a house with 2 stories. We want to enter from the upper level where we want a living room, dining room, and kitchen and 1 big room. We want 3 bedrooms for the kids with their own bath. We want a master bedroom with its own bath. We want a powder room for guests and a utility room for the laundry. Down below, we want a large party room, a room where the kids can play. We want a study for the master of the house that can double as a guest room with its own bath, a utility room for the heater and air conditioner, a 2-car garage with a do-it-yourself workshop at the back end. We want it to be contemporary architecture, built of wood so it fits into the woods, and they told me approximately how much they want to spend. This is a dream assignment for an architect. I told them to go away, come back in a week, and I'd have some sketches for them. Now, have you ever watched what an architect does? Because it's really revealing. What's the first thing he does when the family leaves? What does he draw? You think he draws the rooms? No, what does he draw? He draws the house. He draws the whole without any parts in it. An amazing thing. Has no parts. It's a house. You look at it, you can see it's a house. Now he puts rooms in it. And then he looks at the rooms. But first, when he puts the room in a house, he adapts the properties of the parts to the requirements of the whole. But now he looks at the parts. It's a lousy bedroom. It's too long and narrow. I'm going to have to change the bedroom. But he uses a criterion that a manager never uses in changing a part. What is it? It's not how do I make the part better, how do I change the part to make the house better? That's a very different criterion. It's a recognition that what he does to the room affects the performance of the whole. And that's the primary criterion to use in changing a part. And so he may make a part worse in order to make the house better. And that's exactly what happened to me in the first house I ever designed. When the house was completed, contracts were let, but before construction began, the housewife called me one day. She said, Russ, I can't wait till that house is built. I'm so anxious to move into it. It's wonderful. But there's one aspect of it that worries me. The party and playroom is on the lower level, in the lower part of the hill. The kitchen is up above. I'm going to be running up and down the stairs all the time getting drinks or hors d'oeuvres for company when they're in the party room. Can't we put a dumbwaiter in? Now, you all know what a dumbwaiter is. It's a little elevator goes up and down between the upper level and the lower level. I said, sure, we can put a dumbwaiter in. But the only way to do it is to take counter space away from the kitchen. It's going to make the kitchen harder to work in. She said, I don't care. I want a dumbwaiter. Now, she got it, but look what she did. She made the house better, but the kitchen worse. Now, the fact is that in one unconscious activity, some managers do that, but they're not aware of what they do and they don't use it as a principle. See, a lot of research in the early days of the supermarket revealed an interesting fact. Women only know the prices of a limited number of products. They think they know the prices of everything, but it turns out, according to the study that was done, they only know the price of 6 products. Included are bread and milk. And therefore, you will find that many supermarkets will offer bread on sale at a price which is less than its cost. They're going to lose money on the sale of bread. Why? What's the idea behind offering bread as a loss leader?
Because they're not going to just buy bread.
Bring the housewife in where she'll buy the profitable products. You sacrifice the performance of a product in order to maximize the profit of the whole. Same principle. But have you ever heard a manager tell a division's managers or department managers, hey, next year we don't want you to work as well as you did this year because it will help the corporation? See, they laugh when you say that, but that's exactly right. Because the performance of the whole depends on the way the parts interact. And by making a part act better, you may make the whole work worse by putting a motor from a Rolls-Royce into a Hyundai. So among the most important things management needs to know is how the parts of a system interact and how these interactions affect the performance of the whole. So much for background. That's what you need to understand about a system to understand the transformation that's beginning to occur in management. What I'd like to do is take a short break here. Then when you come back, we'll start to look at the consequences of all this to our understanding of management and organization. Take 15 minutes, sure. Get some coffee back. Okay, now, obviously, we don't have enough time in one morning to go through all of the relevant implications of systems thinking. So I'm just going to pick out a few that are quite important to go through. I know you're exceptional, but it takes 45 hours of an introductory course to graduate students to cover the nature of systems thinking. So what you're getting is kind of a strip tease, you know, just exposing enough to be interesting, but letting all the essentials hidden. And, okay. First, our experience is not organized the way universities are. Now, incredible, you probably never thought about it, but that's the way you think. You talk about there are physical problems, chemical problems, biological problems, psychological problems, economic problems, production problems, aeronautical problems, health problems, crime problems, educational problems. There are absolutely no such things. Problems do not fall into disciplinary categories. The adjective in front of the word problem tells you something, but it doesn't tell you one damn thing about the problem. Understanding that is incredibly important for management in a way that I want to show you. But first I have to prove to you that there is no such thing as a production problem or a management problem or a marketing problem. There are problems, and they do not fall into categories. There's an area just north of the University of Pennsylvania, 80 city blocks with 22,000 people in it. In the 1960s, it was 100% black. It was called an urban black ghetto. It was referred to in the press as the Bottom. Its formal name is Mantua, but it was called the Bottom because it had the highest crime rate in the city, the highest percentage of children born out of wedlock, the highest dropout rate from school, the highest addiction rate, you name it, it was the Bottom. But in 1967, a young man by the name of Herman Rice decided to do something about it because his wife of a few months had almost got killed in the crossfire in a gang fight. So he created a group called the Young Great Society, and they began a self-development effort in that neighborhood. Now, I don't have time to take you through the history of that. I can just tell you that today there are 62 cities in the United States which are using the process that he developed. And he received the America's Award, which is the highest award a civilian can obtain in the United States, from the President of the United States. Fortunately, shortly after he started that effort, which by the way was called the Young Great Society, shortly after he started that effort, he came to the university for help on a project. And fortunately, by chance, he came to me. I had a joint appointment. My primary appointment's in the Wharton School, but I was also in city planning because of my architectural background. He needed a drawing for a proposal he was submitting to the housing department of the city. And he didn't have the drafting competence. So he asked if he could get that from him. We said, sure. But we also, at that time, said there was a group of faculty who were talking about the problems of the surrounding area of the university that would like to meet with him and talk to him about some possible collaboration. And that started a collaboration in which we had a small group of faculty available to him and the community to use in ways that the community saw fit. We did not try to tell them how to solve their problems. We didn't know how. And so we were increasingly used by the community in a variety of different ways, and we're discovering how we could help in various ways. This got to be regularized within a year. We had 2 people assigned to working with the community full-time, and they met every Monday morning in my office for usually 2 to 3 hours to discuss the problems coming up in the coming week, what could be done to help, what had happened in the last week. And it was during one of these meetings that a young man from the community, Forrest Adams, came in with a piece of news that stopped the meeting dead. There was an 83-year-old woman who lived in the neighborhood who had organized what we called the geriatric set. These were all older people, most of them on welfare, retired, and they had done some incredible things to help the development of that neighborhood. For example, they opened 3 infant care centers, not daycare centers, infant care centers. They took babies 3 months old until they were 3 years old when they could go to a daycare center. So mama could go back to work or go to school. Okay? More than half of those kids at 3 years of age were literate, believe it or not. In that infant care center, they were teaching reading and writing, among other things, to these infants. They had removed graffiti from buildings around the neighborhood. They had taken vacant lots that were rubbish dumps, cleared them, made them recreational and relaxation spots. From the state, they received saplings of trees and planted trees along the sidewalks of the streets in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, this woman had a bad heart, but she had no medical attention. Mantua had absolutely no medical facilities within it. The closest facility was a hospital which is part of the University of Pennsylvania hospital system. It's called the Presbyterian Hospital. If you know Philadelphia, it's at the corner of 38th and Market Street. It's 2 miles from where she lived, and she couldn't walk 2 miles. There was no public transportation in Mantua. It had all been withdrawn by the city because it wasn't safe. And she couldn't afford a taxi cab, so she did without any medical facilities until one of our projects was we took an old house in the middle of the neighborhood, remodeled it, and got the University of Pennsylvania to staff a free clinic that operated 3 days a week. And for the first time in her life, she was able to get medical attention with a checkup every month. That morning, she had gone for a checkup. They gave her an EKG, they did a stress test, they did an ultrasound, the usual things you do with a person with a bad heart. She passed all the tests, so they told her she was free to go home, which she did. Home for her was 2 rooms on the 4th floor of a big old converted house, because that neighborhood had once been a very wealthy neighborhood with a lot of very big homes in it that had been converted years ago into these flats. On the 3rd flight of stairs, returning to her room from her medical exam, she had a heart attack and died. That's the news that was brought to us. There was a silence in the room, because we all knew that woman well, and it was real sadness. The first one to speak was Sam Martin, a professor of community medicine. He said, "Damn it, I told you that we don't have enough doctors in the clinic. I've been harping on this. If we had more doctors in the clinic, we'd be able to make house calls, and if we could make house calls, this never would have happened." That was obviously true, so nobody had any comments to make. There was a silence, and then Frank Adams, a professor of economics, spoke up. He said, "Sam," he said, "there are plenty of doctors in Philadelphia." He said, "Unfortunately, they're private practitioners, and she couldn't afford one. If her welfare payments were larger, or if we had a national health care plan, she could have called a doctor who would have come to see her." That was equally true. Another silence, and then Larry Goldfarb, a young professor of architecture, said, "Why don't we make them put elevators in those buildings?" The only woman present then shook her head. She was a professor of social work. "What a pity," she said. "You don't know a damn thing about that woman. You don't know that she was married as a teenager and shortly thereafter gave birth to a son. And when the son was born, she was deserted by her husband and never saw him again. She raised that son as a single parent with loving care, doing menial housework. He was brilliant. He graduated from public school in Mantua and took the mayor's examination and got a free scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania, which he attended and graduated at the top of his class with a Bachelor of Arts in Science. He was awarded a scholarship which he had applied for to the law school, graduated at the top of his class in the law school, and was hired by the biggest law firm in Philadelphia. He is now a senior partner in that law firm. He's married and has 2 children. He lives in a beautiful house out in the suburbs, which happens to be all on 1 floor. Now, if she weren't alienated from her son," she said, "she'd be living with him where she'd have all the money she needs and no steps to climb." Now, here's your midterm examination question. Is that a medical problem, an economic problem, an architectural problem, or a social work problem?
All 4.
It's none of them. It's none of them. What do those adjectives tell you? They tell you the point of view of the person looking at the problem. They don't tell you anything about the problem, Lo and behold, the doctor looks at a problem, it's a medical problem. Of course, that's the only kind he can see. The economist looks at the same problem, it's an economic problem, and so on. These are points of view. And recognizing that has incredible importance. Now, before I show you exactly what it is, let's take a simple case. Is there anybody in this room that never had a headache? You didn't. You're lucky.
No, I'm sorry. I thought you said.
Oh, you did have a headache. Good. Because I want to ask you, when you get a headache, what do you normally do? Brain surgery? Of course not. That would be stupid, wouldn't it? But that's where the pain is. What do? You take a pill which contains a chemical, swallow it. It dissolves in the stomach and the chemical enters your bloodstream, which then carries it to the brain and deposits it on the pain center of the brain, and the headache goes. Because somebody understands the way the parts of the system interact. He does not try to solve the problem where it appears, but where he can enter the interactions which produce the problem so as to get the biggest bang for the buck. But that's exactly what management does not do. If a manager of marketing comes in the morning and discovered that New England sales went to hell in the last quarter, what does he say? Uh-oh, I got a marketing problem. And now he tries to solve it by manipulating marketing variables. And he can have some effect on the problem. That's not the point. The point is that the best way of attacking the problem? Now, one thing I can tell you with some authority based on experience, because I've worked in more than 400 corporations in my lifetime, is that over 90% of the problems I've ever seen in corporations or government agencies are best solved somewhere other than where they appear. But that requires a kind of organizations which we don't have, so that marketing jealously holds on to the problems which it recognizes. It doesn't want to let finance or personnel or some other department come in and steal its problem from it at a tremendous cost to corporations. I want to give you an example to show you what I mean. The largest producer of coated papers in the United States is a company called Champion Paper and Fiber Company, which was subsequently purchased, is now a part of International Paper. In those days, it was and still is the largest producer of very expensive paper. It's a high quality of paper with a transparent clay coating that enables it to take color photography very effectively. So it's a paper that's used in all art and expensive journals like House Beautiful, Architectural Digest, all the art books on Picasso and Mondrian, and so on. That paper is produced in a plant in Hamilton, Ohio, which consists of 8 continuous production lines, starting with wood pulp on clay at one end and coming out with these big cylinders of paper 4 feet high that are sent off to printers to use for various journals and books. The vice president of that company, which is headquartered in New York, and for whom we had done work in the past, called me one day and asked me to meet him at the plant in Hamilton, Ohio, which I did. He told me that productivity of the plant had decreased precipitously in the last 5 years, and it was no longer profitable, and something had to be done about it. He said, I don't understand what happened. 5 years ago, this was a very profitable plant. So when I saw the figures, I decided it must be the equipment is old. Now, this is an old company. It was organized in 1812. I remember that date because it's the date of a famous war with England. But more than that, it was organized by a family that had an incredible dedication. It was a Quaker family that felt an obligation to its customers, and therefore its slogan was, "We will never discontinue a paper." They guaranteed their customers access to any paper they wanted to perpetuity. As a result, over the years, they accumulated a very large number of papers. In fact, they had 2,700 different papers 5 years ago in that plant that they were offering for sale. He said, I had time studies done on the 8 production lines on each piece of equipment and the line as a whole. He showed me the charts, and there was absolutely no difference over 5 years. He said, it's not the equipment. It's older, but it's not any poorer than it was before. He said, then it occurred to me that the only thing that could explain it, it must be down for repair and maintenance more. So he gathered all the repair and maintenance reports, brought them together, analyzed them, showed me the results. No difference. It wasn't that. He said, now I was really puzzled. But then somebody reminded me that 5 years ago we had a competitive war. One of our competitors, who was jealous over our major share of the market, began to introduce new papers and take away market share from us. So we responded by developing new papers of our own. As a result, he said, in the last 5 years, we've introduced almost 500 new papers. We now have about 3,200 papers in our product line. He said, now what happens when you increase the number of products to be produced over a fixed production facility? Well, the answer is obvious. You have more production runs of shorter duration, but between production runs, you have to adjust the equipment. It's called setup time. And therefore, if you got more production runs, you have more setup time, which is unproductive. And he then showed me a plot of setup time, and there it was. Setup time went up as the mirror image of productivity. He had located his headache. Increased setup time. So he said to us, is there some way of scheduling production so as to minimize setup time? That seems completely irrational, doesn't it? But he was asking, can I do brain surgery? I got a headache. And we said, yes, you can. Because we were naive and excited for a very important reason. That's a classic problem in network theory. And for those of you interested in network theory, it's an example of what's called the traveling salesman problem. It was an unsolved problem for which the Rand Corporation offered a $10,000 prize for the first solution. The first solution to that problem had appeared about a month before this incident. A professor at MIT, Jack Little, published an approximate solution to that problem, and here was a chance to use it. So we said, yes, we have a way now of minimizing setup time given what you want to produce. But we said, we can't guarantee you a big saving. He said, why not? He said, because that depends on the forecast as well as the scheduling. How? He said. We said, well, if you got a lousy forecast, if you produce efficiently to it, you're not going to make money. You need a combination of a decent forecast and the good scheduling method. He said, well, how can I find out whether it's worthwhile going after? We said, what we'll do is build a simulation of the plant in the computer. We'll rerun the last 5 years, assuming we had a perfect forecasted demand, and use the new scheduling method. We will then be able to calculate how much we would have saved over the 5 years under those two conditions, and that will give us an upper limit to the savings that are possible, because we'll never have a perfect forecast. He said, that's a good idea. So we did that. It took about 3 weeks, and sure enough, the difference was large enough to go after. But we learned something in the process. We came back to him. We said, look, you probably know this, but 8% of your products account for 90% of your production and 100% of your profit. He said, I know that. He said, then why don't you just reduce the product line? Because you can get a lot more saving by reducing the product line than by improving production. He shook his head. He said, boy, I knew you were going to come through with something stupid like that. Why is it stupid? He said, because I don't want to allow marketing to come in here and tell me how to run production, and they control the product line. We said, well, you don't have to worry about that. We work with marketing, and we can go there and talk to them, Turkey. He said, no. He said, you don't have that kind of influence on them. I know those bastards, and they're going to come in here and try to run this plant, and I don't want them in here. So you can't go talk to them, he said. Well, we were frustrated. We went back to work on the scheduling problem, but we cheated. We had the computing department run a run on the IBM system. That was an old 700 system. 3,200 products, from the most profitable to the least profitable, how much was made each year, how much was sold each year, and to whom. There's a big accordion. Remember those accordions that you used to get out of the 700? And then we started at the bottom of the list and said, how many products will we have to drop out of the product line, starting from the least profitable, working up, to get the saving we would get with a perfect forecast, which we'll never get, and the new scheduling method. It turned out to be 4%. Now that's less than the number of products introduced in the last 5 years, so we were all excited. Go back to see the production manager and say, we know you told us not to look at this. But are you aware of the fact that by only dropping 4%, we can get a saving that you'll never attain by production scheduling? He blew his top. He said, damn it, I told you, don't monkey with the product line. Well, we argued, and finally we had an idea. We said, tell you what, if you let us go to marketing, we'll go there and explain that we're there against your will and why. And if they continue to bother you after that, we will continue the study at no cost to you. And he paused and he looked at us. He said, put that on paper. So we had to write a letter of agreement, which was the most unusual one I ever was involved with, in which we agreed to these conditions. And we went to New York, met with the vice president of marketing, who was very welcoming. We went through the logic of the whole procedure, and he agreed with everything we said until we got to the end. We said, we want to drop at least the last 4% on this list of products. He said, you can't do it. Why not? We said, you agreed with everything we said. He went like, he says, I'm going to teach you a lesson. And boy, he did in the next couple of minutes. He said, what kind of paper is at the bottom of your list? So I opened up my accordion, I said, 421J63. He said, no, I don't want to know the number. What kind of paper is it? I said, I don't know. What difference does it make? He said, oh boy, you're going to be hard to educate. He said, let me start over again. Who bought that paper last year? I checked my records. I said, you made one sale of it to customer 72-94. He said, no, I don't want to know the number. Who bought the paper? I said, look, I don't know, and I don't have to be a genius to know it doesn't make one damn bit of difference. Because I know this, you sold 2 pounds of that paper last year. The smallest quantity you can produce is 2,000 pounds. You know how many years' supply you've got in stock of that paper? You're not going to be here to see that roll used up. And he shook his head. He said, boy, you've got to be stupid to be that smart. I said, I don't understand. He said, well, let me try to explain it to you. And then he asked a question, came out of the blue. Did you ever hear of Claire Booth Luce? I said, of course I heard of Claire Booth Luce. He said, who is she? He said, she's best known as a playwright. She has a very successful play on Broadway. But she's also very active in politics and has started something that later became the women's liberation movement. He said, good. He said, do you happen to know whether she's married or not? I said, yeah, she's married. He said, do you know who she's married to? I said, sure. She's married to Henry Luce. He said, very good. He said, do you have any idea what Henry Luce does for a living? I said, yeah, he's chairman of Time, Life, and Fortune. He said, do you also know that he's our largest customer, that he bought $44 million worth of paper from this company last year? And do you think I'm not going to give her a lousy 2 pounds of letter paper and run the risk of losing his business? He said, don't be stupid. That's not the lesson, because I would hear this kind of thing all the time. So I asked him the obvious academic question. How do you know that if you don't give her 2 pounds of letter paper, you're going to lose a $44 million worth of business? And then I learned the lesson. He said, I don't know. You can be damn sure I'm not going to try to find out. See, he had it right. He said, however small the risk is, it's not worth taking for a lousy 2 pounds of paper. We were licked. We left with our tail between our legs, went back to Hamilton and sulked. A because we were convinced the scheduling was not the way to go at that problem. We became sufficiently convinced that we stopped to think. And then we invoked a principle in science called Hitches Principle. Now, Charles Hitch was a major figure in the Rand Corporation out here in California, who later became the president of the University of California. And in a rare moment of clarity, he made the following statement. If you can't solve the problem you're facing, you must be facing the wrong problem. That turns out to be a wonderful principle because it forces you to go back and re-examine the formulation of the problem you've been working on. So we did. So what are we trying to do? What we're trying to do is reduce the number of products that have to be made because that will produce a bigger saving than improving the scheduling of the production. And we've assumed that the only way of doing that is reduce the products in the product lines so you reduce the number of products that will be sold. And we no sooner said that than we saw another way of doing the same thing. We knew that the salesmen were paid a base commission, base salary, plus a commission on the sales they made. The commission was a percentage of the dollar value of what they sold. And it didn't make one damn bit of difference to the salesman whether he sold a profitable dollar or an unprofitable dollar. He got the same commission for a dollar sale, whatever it was. So we redesigned the compensation system for the salesman using the same basic salary, but set a percentage on the profit of a sale with zero compensation or commission for unprofitable sales. And then set the percentage of the profit in such a way, and this was the trick, that if next year they sold exactly what they sold this year, their earnings would be identical. But if they sold less of the unprofitable products, it would have no effect on their earnings. But if they sold more of the profitable products, their earnings would go up. Well, when we developed all that, we took it back to the production manager, showed it to him, and he blew his top again. But then he calmed down. He said, he said, that's kind of cute. He said, unfortunately, I don't control salesman compensation. He said, the personnel department does. But he said, you can go talk to them. They don't try to run production. So we went off to see the vice president of personnel, showed it to him, and he liked it. He said, this is interesting. He said, I'll tell you what. The United States is divided into 5 marketing areas. We'll take the Northwest, Washington, Oregon, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, and Montana. And we'll introduce this system for 6 months there and see what happens. And then if it works, we'll take it across the nation. Well, we couldn't have asked for more, and that's what he did. In those 6 months, 65% of the products in the product line were not sold. Sale of the profitable products went up by 18.5%. Corporate profits from that region doubled. Salesman income went up 225%. And the improvement in production from the change in one region was 4.5 times as large as you would get with a perfect schedule and a perfect forecast. Now, what kind of a problem was it? Was it a production scheduling problem, a product line design problem, or a salesman compensation problem? You see, the parts of the system interact. And the question is, which interaction do you get into the system with to get the biggest bang for the buck? And you can't learn that when you're organized into silos where the performance of the parts is evaluated in terms of their independent performance, but they're interdependent parts. Is that clear? Because it's an incredibly critical point. You have any questions about that point? This is what I just been talking about. This just says the same things. Another thing you're not taught in school. There are multiple ways of dealing with a problem. Now, you instinctively, just in the course of growing up by osmosis, learn 2 ways. And if you were lucky, went to an advanced educational institution, you learned the 3rd way. But there are 4 ways that are possible. The first way is problem absolution. The problem arises, you say, oh, the hell with it. Leave it alone. It'll solve itself. It'll go away. This is the way parents solve most of the problems that their kids get into. The kids are fighting, let them alone. They'll work it out. That's absolution, management by default. Now, we actually had an administration in the United States where that was the conscious policy strategy of decision-making. That was Eisenhower. When Eisenhower came into the presidency, the country was doing reasonably well, and he said, let well enough alone. It's the reformers that make things worse by trying to make them better. So don't rock the boat. Let nature take its course. They were all policies of do as little as you possibly can. When you have to do something, make sure you don't interfere too much. Absolution. That works pretty well under two conditions. One is that you're doing pretty well and the environment isn't changing. Well, needless to say, that's no longer true. It may have been true in the early 50s, but it's no longer true. Imagine trying to fly an airplane through a hurricane on automatic pilot. You can't do it. The only equilibrium that's possible in a turbulent environment is dynamic. So the way we normally deal with the problem is resolution. It's based on past experience in two ways. A problem arises, you say to yourself, did I ever have this problem before? Well, I had something pretty much like it. What did I do the last time? Did it work? Could I do it now, or do I have to modify it a little bit? In other words, you're using past experience and common sense and judgment to figure out what to do in the current situation where your objective is to do better than doing nothing. That's called satisficing, to do well enough without doing the best that's possible. The alternative way to resolve a problem is, I didn't have this problem before. What happened to create it? You look for what's to blame. If I can find out that you were the cause of the problem, I eliminate you and I'm back to where I was. So in either strategy, I'm trying to go back to a previous state that was better than the current state. That's resolution. Re is back solving. It wasn't until World War II that we developed a third way of treating problems, and that occurred in England in 1938. The Battle of Britain began in 1938 when the Germans began to bomb hell out of England, and England had no effective defense. It did have anti-aircraft, which was new at that time, but it didn't know how to use it. And it was ineffective. The Germans were bombing England at a couple thousand feet. You know, they were practically down on the ground. In desperation, the British government asked the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, P.M.S. Blackett, to organize a group to look and see if they could improve the use of anti-aircraft. Blackett did a curious thing. He organized a group of 6 other scientists, each one drawn from a different discipline. He had a geographer, a geometer, a biologist, a psychologist, an economist, and so on. And this group got to be called Blackett's Circus. None of them knew a damn thing about anti-aircraft, but they went to work on the problem. And in several months, they came out with a proposed reallocation of anti-aircraft installations and a different principle for their use, which the British accepted out of desperation. It increased the effectiveness by over 300%, and the British were tickled pink. They said, this is a good thing, so we need more of it. They organized groups of scientists, 5 to 8, and put them every place they could throughout the military. Now, the British military, like the American, is divided into 5 functions: administration, intelligence, operations, and logistics. And they wanted to put these groups where they could do the most good. That means where they come in contact with the enemy. That was operations. So these groups of scientists were placed in commands of operations and got to be called operational research. Our liaison officers from this country in Britain, watching this development, imported it here immediately, and it became a major component of the World War II effort on both sides of the Atlantic. At the end of the war, the British published a book on the reasons the Allies succeeded and it attributed it to 3 technological developments: radar, sonar, and operational research. In this country, it was kept classified until the end of the war, when Ellis Johnson, who headed the Army group at Johns Hopkins University, published the first public disclosure in an article called America's Greatest Secret Weapon. Immediately, all the colleges and universities picked it up and started to teach the tools and techniques developed by scientists working on the problems of management. It's not common sense anymore. This is mathematical, experimental, it's analytic, it's using the best methods available to a scientist to analyze problems and to try to optimize solutions to it. And this was the peak that we obtained in the late 40s, and by the 1960s, you could learn it in any engineering curriculum. You learn linear programming and game theory and inventory theory and sequencing theory and so on. All these tools and techniques developed by scientists became commonplace. But it wasn't until the late 1960s that we began to ask a very interesting question. Can you do any better than the best? Well, you see, if you just ask the question that way, it sounds stupid, doesn't it? How can, it's a contradiction. The best is the best. How can you do better than the best? Well, the fact is you can, for 2 reasons. First, problems don't stay solved. If I solve the problem today, circumstances are going to change in the next week and the solution won't work under the new circumstances. In a dynamic environment, problems don't stay solved necessarily, and so they have to be continually resolved to take into account changing conditions. So if a company develops a good advertising strategy that works great today, if a competitor comes along and develops a new advertising strategy, you better react to it. So first, solutions don't persist over changing environments, and secondly, and more important, every solution creates new problems. You see, every problem that Galileo faced in physics has been solved, but physics didn't disappear. Why not? Because every solution creates at least 2 new problems, so the number of problems increases geometrically as you solve problems. So today there are more problems in physics than there ever was before. And so the question becomes this: is there some way of treating a problem so that it stays solved in changing environments and does not create new problems? If you could do that, you would have something better than solving problems, doing the best. And the answer is there is. There is something you can do that will meet those 2 conditions. It's called problem dissolution, dissolving a problem. It's redesigning the system that has the problem or its environment so the problem can arise no matter what the environment is. Okay? It's not solvable. It will not have to be solved in a new environment and does not give rise to new problems. The core of this process is design. Now, just to observe, the core to problem solving was the analytical method as exemplified by science. Design is exactly the opposite. It's synthesis, not analysis. In design, you put things together into wholes. In analysis, you take wholes apart into parts. Okay? Now, some examples so you can see what this is like. The simplest example I've ever seen was one that involved the paper book of matches. You've all seen paper books of matches you used to get when you bought cigarettes or a cigar or pipe tobacco. The largest manufacturer of them in the United States is a company called the Ohio Match Company. And they were in the courts continuously because people would get this book of matches and not close it, strike a match, and a spark would come off, hit the other matches, and the book would explode and burn the hand of the person using the matches. And so this company was in the courts continuously being sued by people with burnt hands. They consulted their lawyers and got the usual kind of nonsense from them. It said print at the bottom, close cover before striking. And so in very small letters, they started to print that along the bottom. Had no effect. People didn't read it, it was too small, and if they read it, they didn't care. They kept it open, continued to burn their hands. Now, the story goes that one day a young man came into the company, got to the receptionist and said he wanted to see the CEO. She said, why? He said he had a way of treating the burned hand problem that wouldn't cost the company anything but would eliminate the problem. She said, well, what is it? He said, oh no, I want to talk to the CEO. So she called the CEO and explained. He was curious and he said, send the young man up. The young man went up, and after the amenities, the CEO said, okay, now what's your solution? The young man said, how much is it worth? The CEO said, how can I tell you how much it's worth when I don't know what it is? And they argued for a while. And finally they wound up with lawyers on two sides of the table, and they negotiated a contract in which they agreed to pay the young man $40,000 if he could tell them how to eliminate the problem without any cost to the company. Now you all know what he did. What did he do?
The striker on the other
He
side.
took the abrasive and put it on the back. And now it didn't make one damn bit of difference. If you kept the book of matches open, there's no way that the spark could hit the other matches. He eliminated the problem without creating any new ones. That's problem disillusion. Now, as a professor, I longed for a case in which I could see all four methods of treating a problem occur in that order I just gave you, because it's a hierarchy. And unfortunately, I couldn't find one in my own experience. And then one day I bumped into it by sheer accident in England. We were doing joint research with the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is probably the foremost institution in human relations research in the world. And I was sitting with Fred Emery, an Australian social psychologist, who was at that time the chairman of the institute, when he was called out on an emergency. He excused himself and said, I'll get back as fast as I can. In the meantime, keep yourself busy. So I sat in his office working with the door open, and his across-the-hall neighbor came back from a trip. He was an old friend, a Dutch professor. His name was Hans van Beenem. And he was clearly coming from a trip. He had his overcoat on and carrying two suitcases. I jumped up to say hello to him. And in the course of exchanging greetings, it was apparent he was in a state of depression, which was unusual for him. So I asked him, I said, Hans, what's the matter? You know, you're down in the dumps. It's not characteristic. What's wrong? Oh, he said, I got a terrible problem. I'm getting nowhere with it, and I don't know what to do. So why don't you tell me about it? No, he said, there's no point in bothering you with my problem. I said, well, I'm not doing anything anyhow. I'm waiting for Fred. Why don't we go in your office, get comfortable, and maybe by just talking about it, you'll learn something about it. He paused, he said, all right, if you're willing, okay. So we went into his office, and here's the story he told me. There's a major city of Europe in which the principal means of transportation is a double-decker bus. The double-decker bus has two people on it, has a driver up front who's separated from the body of the bus by a glass-enclosed compartment where he sits and drives the bus. People enter and leave the bus by an entrance at the back end. If you've ever been to New York and seen the double-decker bus on Fifth Avenue, it's exactly that bus. There's a conductor at the back end. He collects a fare from people who come on the bus, and in this particular city in Europe, they had what's called a zone fare system. It's not a flat rate. The amount that you pay him depends on a number of zones into which the city is divided that you pass through in going to your destination. So if you're going through 3 zones, you pay more than you would if you're going through 2 zones, and so on. By the way, the taxi cabs in Washington, D.C., if you've ever used them, operate on the same system. It's called a zone fare system. He gives you a receipt, and you're supposed to check the receipt when you get off the bus to make sure you didn't cheat. So you don't get on and say, I'm going to zone 3, when actually you're going to zone 5 and you didn't pay for 2 additional zones. He also has a third function, which we'll see in a moment. Now, the management of this system This is all the story that's being told to me. Decided to increase his productivity by introducing incentives. That was very simple for the driver. They gave him a schedule of the times he was expected to arrive and depart from the terminal at each end of the run, put a time clock in the terminals, and gave him a time card. So every time he entered a terminal, he checked in, and when he left the terminal, he checked out. At the end of the week, they calculated how close he kept the schedule, and his compensation was a function of that deviation. He made more under this system than he had under the old fixed salary system, and the improvement was noticeable in the performance of the system. Now, the conductor was harder. They would have plainclothes inspectors get on the bus several times during a tour that the conductor could not identify, but he would watch the conductor to make sure he collected the fare from everybody who got on the bus and checked the receipt when they got off. And every time he failed to do that, he would get a demerit. At the end of the week, his compensation was a function of the number of demerits he got, but he also made more money under this system than he had under the old system, and he liked it. But the system got into trouble. At peak hours, you might have 20 to 30 people waiting in a stop to get on the bus. The conductor would not hold the bus up while he collected the fare from 20 people coming on the bus. He lets them get on the bus and collects the fare between stops. Now, stops were 3 blocks apart, so he had some time. But when the bus got really crowded, he had a problem. He would be standing in the aisles, and there's a stairwell in the back that goes up to the second level. They'd actually be standing in the stairwell. He'd have to fight his way up to get to the upper level to collect the fare from the people who had gone up there when he let them on the bus at the stop. By the time he gets up there, they're approaching the next stop. Does he go down and give the driver a signal? No, he doesn't, because they had a sensible rule. The rule read as follows. If, to the driver, unless you get a signal from the conductor, you must stop at the next stop. So now the conductor says, what the hell, I'm not going to go down and give him a signal, because he's going to have to stop. And if anybody wants to get off the bus, they'll get off. Now, if nobody wants to get off and he stops, he'll see it through the rear view mirror, and he'll go on. He loses a little time, but that's his problem, not mine. So he stays up there collecting fares. Now, one day, by chance, at 3 consecutive stops, the conductor continued to collect fares on this upper level. Nobody got on or off the bus at 3 stops. The driver was furious. He had lost a significant amount of time, and that cost him money. So he parked the bus, opened up his cab door, came around, climbed up the stairs, got a hold of the conductor, pulled him off the bus, and beat hell out of him. This started a war. There were 2 separate unions, conductors and drivers, but more important, there was a race issue involved. The conductors were generally immigrants of a minority race. There was a lot of racial prejudice in that country. The drivers were true blue. And so the unions organized bands of workers, each union, armed with clubs, and they go around the city looking for each other, engaging in physical combat. In the first week, they hospitalized a number of people, and they terrorized parts of the city, so the press immediately got after the management of the system and said, you've got to do something about this. And management said, look, these are adults, give them a little time, they'll work it out. Absolution. In the second week, the intensity of the conflict increased. Press got after management and said, you have to do something, you can't do nothing. So management sat down and said, okay, we didn't have this problem a while back. What happened to create it? What was the answer? The incentive system. So we're going to get rid of the incentive system, go back to the flat salary. They announced this, and both unions said they'd be on strike. Why? They said, unless you're willing to pay us the maximum amount we made when we were on the incentive system, and pay us that amount as a fixed salary, we will not go back to work. Management said, we can't pay you that amount unless you can guarantee us the same productivity that we got when we paid you that amount. The union said, we can't do that because that depends on the weather and drivers and driving conditions, and we can't guarantee those things. The management said, then we can't pay you that salary. So it didn't get resolved. The slaughter continued, so management called on 2 university professors to come in and see what they could do. With typical arrogance, these 2 university professors took one look at the problem and said, there's a simple mathematical solution. I don't know what the fuss is all about, they said. At the end of the week, add the incentive to the conductor and the driver. Add them together and divide them in half. And now each one will depend on the performance of the other, and they'll be forced to collaborate. Great in principle, isn't it? Both unions said they go on strike. Why? Well, it was quoted to me that both unions said they would not allow their income to be dependent on those other bastards. They wanted their income to be independent of their enemy. So it didn't work. At this point, they came to Tavistock Institute and asked Tavistock Institute if they could do something with this problem. And it was given to my friend Hans von Benen. This is all being described to me. He said, what I did is I went into the center of the city and hired a room in the best hotel in town that had a banquet table in the middle, and I set up 2 sideboards on both sides of the banquet table. On one, I had a bar with a selection and quality of drinks much better than what the conductors and the drivers would normally afford. I had the best scotches, and I had the best gins and the best mixers. On the other side, I had a buffet of food, of higher quality and better type foods than they could normally afford. He said, each night I got 4 conductors and 4 drivers selected at random to come in at 6:30 and gave them an hour to interact socially, drink and eat before they sat down at 7:30 to discuss the problem. He said he didn't interact. They formed 2 groups of 4 until they sat down at a table with 4 drivers on one side, 4 conductors on the other, and Tavistock people at the 2 ends of the table. He said, I've just come from the 3rd such meeting. They have all ended in physical violence. He said, we're now being sued by the hotel for damages to the room. He said, I can't do any more of these, and I don't know what to do. They don't work. Then he stopped and he looked at me with great big soulful eyes. He said, you got any ideas? I said, of course not. I said, but I do have some questions. He said, like what? I said, well, I'm curious. How many buses operate in the system at peak hours? He said, I don't know, and it doesn't make any difference. He said, you have the problem whether you got 10 buses or 1,000 buses. What difference does it make? I said, well, the bus is a part of a system. And I don't have any idea what the containing system is like. And I can't look at a problem as separate from the system of which it's a part. I've got to know how it interacts. He said, but it won't do you any good because the problem is independent of the number of stops. I said, well, just tell me where I can find out and I'll go do it. And he wouldn't let me. He came with me to the files, we hunted up, and there were 1,250 buses operating in the system at peak hours. It's a big system. He looked at me and says, all right, now what do you want to know? I said, well, it's raising another question. How many stops are in the system? He said, Russ, you really don't understand the problem. You see, it doesn't make any difference how many stops there are. These are 2 people on a bus. All you require is a bus and a stop. And you have to have at least 3 stops. That's all you need for the problem. What the hell do you want to know the number of stops for? So because I want to understand what the containing system is like. Why? He said. I said, I don't know until I understand the system. He said, well, I don't know, and the only way we can find out is get a map and count them. I said, all right, let's get the map, I'll count them. Well, he reluctantly got the map, and we counted 850 stops. Now that meant that at peak hours, with stops 3 blocks apart, on the average, you had another bus coming while one bus was stopped. You can see that in New York on 5th Avenue. If you stand at a corner where a bus stops, you look up the street, you'll see another bus coming at peak hours. Now, if you look at those 2 numbers, 1,250 buses at peak hours, 850 stops, you can dissolve the problem. You see how to do it? I can change the system so the problem no longer exists. Take the conductor off the bus and put him on the stop. Now look at what happens. At peak hours, you reduce the number of conductors from 1,250 to 850, right? With consequences we'll see in a moment. He collects a fare from people while they're waiting to get on the bus. He's always at the rear door where he can check their receipts when they get off the bus. And he's always in a position to signal the driver when he can move on to the next stop. When the number of buses becomes less than the number of stops, the conductors get back on the bus again. This enabled them to change the system so that instead of working 4 hours on, 4 off, and 4 on to cover peak hours, everybody in the system went on to 8-hour shifts at a fixed salary, and they were tickled pink because now they were working an 8-hour day instead of a 12-hour day. Okay? The city was sufficiently satisfied. They built canopies with cover for the people waiting in line, put pipe railings up to form the queues, and even benches for those that wanted to sit down and wait for the bus. And that system was subsequently moved to other cities. But you don't have to go to other cities. How many ever rode on a subway? Where was the conductor in the subway? He's at the stop. He's not on the train. Because anybody stops and think about a transportation system in which the number of stops is less than the number of vehicles, he obviously ought to go at the stop. If you ever took a train in England, where was the conductor? Do you remember? When you went to the train, you went through a gate and showed your ticket to a man at the gate. When you came off the train, you came through a gate and showed the man at the gate the ticket. Conductors are at the stops. So by a redesign of the system, you eliminate the problem. And eliminating the problem is problem dissolution. Now, the importance of this is that we learn that design is the critical factor in the use of systems thinking in the resolution, solution, and dissolution of problems. We've learned a lot about design, especially since the beginning of systemic thinking. And the initial push came from a vice president of Bell Telephone Laboratories, who in 1951 initiated a process which has since, with elaboration, become one of the major methodologies of system thinkers. By sheer luck, I happened to be there when this happened, and for reasons I'll explain in a moment. In 1951, I was on the faculty of Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland. That was before it combined with Western Reserve to form Case Western Reserve. Like all institutes of technology, we would be canvassed by high-tech companies all through the year who were trying to hire our best graduate students. So companies like Boeing, IBM, AT&T, and so on, all had liaison people that came to see and interview our best graduate students. The representative from AT&T was a young man, his name was Peter Myers, who was a Rhodes Scholar with a PhD in physics from Oxford University. He was very bright and very personable, and he used to come around often, so we became good friends. And we started to do some writing together. Whenever I had to go to New York for a project we had there, I would try to arrange to spend time with him. And he, when he came out to Cleveland to do his recruiting, would try to spend time with me. So one week in which I had to be in New York for a project on a Thursday with Union Carbide, I phoned him at the beginning of the week and said, I got to be in New York on Thursday. I'm free on Wednesday. If I came in, could I work with you on Wednesday on our paper? He said, yes, I'm free Wednesday. On Tuesday, before that Wednesday, about noon, I got a phone call from New York saying there was an emergency on the project with Union Carbide. Come in right away. I got a plane, got me to New York about 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. We worked well into the night, got the problem solved. I don't even remember what it was, but it was close to midnight when they got me a hotel room nearby, and I arranged for a rental car to be available the next morning so I could drive to Murray Hill, New Jersey, where Bell Labs was located. It's about a 30-minute drive out of New York. The next morning I got up early and drove there and got to Peter's office about 8:45. He wasn't there. It was about 10:50 when he appeared, and for the first time in our association, I saw him angry. He was a very sweet-tempered person, and it was shocking. He came in, he didn't say good morning. He said, "Where the hell were you last night?" So I was in New York. "Why, what's the matter, Pete?" He said, "I know you were in New York. Your office knew you were in New York, but nobody knew how to get a hold of you in New York." I said, "For good reason, because I didn't know when I left the office. And by the time I find out, the office was closed. But what's the problem?" He calmed down a little bit. He said, "I'm upset, but not at you." He said, "Unfortunately, at 4:30 yesterday afternoon, the vice president in charge of the laboratories called all the section heads in Bell Labs, and he was the section head, and said there'd be a meeting this morning at 9 o'clock at which attendance was compulsory, that no excuse for absence was acceptable." And he looked at me and he said, "I got to go to that meeting in a few minutes. I tried to reach you to tell you not to come. I can't work with you." I said, "Well, it's a shame. It was unavoidable. You better go to your meeting. I'll sit here and work for a while. If you're not back by noon, I'll go back to New York where I have to be tomorrow anyhow." He said, "Well, I knew you'd say that, but I feel guilty." I said, "You shouldn't. You didn't do anything. You better go to the meeting." So he started to walk out, and he stopped in the doorway, turned around and said, "Wait a minute." He said, "Why don't you come with me?" I said, "I can't go with you. You said it's a meeting of section heads." He said, "Hell," he said, "they'll never know the difference. Come on." I said, "Well, suppose they do know the difference. Won't you get in trouble?" And he paused. He said, "I'll tell you what." He said, "You come with me, but we won't sit together. So that if they catch you, I'll pretend not to know you." I said, "You know, what the hell can they do to me? I'm not an employee here." So off we went. We got to a small classroom that held about 40 people, seats divided by a center aisle. And by sheer chance, on the last row, the two seats separated by the aisle were empty. So I took the one on the right, and Peter took the one on the left. And we could talk across the aisle, but we obviously were not there together. And the vice president wasn't there yet, and that was unusual. He was normally on time, but at 9:10, he still wasn't there. He was 6'3", a 250-pound, back-slapping extrovert. He couldn't get near you without hugging you, pinching you, punching you, pushing you, or doing something physical. He was cherubic, had bright red cheeks, and was congenitally cheerful. He knew everybody by name, it seemed, had his nose in everybody's business. They thought he was a great executive, but they didn't like to spend a lot of time with him because he was overbearing. He was never late, but here he was late. So there was a good deal of anxiety in the room, and it wasn't until about 9:15 that the back door opened, and they have one of these devices that closes the door, you know, the pneumatic device, and it squeaked. Everybody turned around and looked, and they knew immediately there was a crisis. He was bent over. He was a pasty gray. Without looking up, he slowly shuffled down the center aisle, got up in front and back of the podium, put his elbows on the podium, and held his head, and the room was dead silent. And something terrible had happened. We didn't know what. We waited to hear. He finally looked up and he said, "Gentlemen," in a very weak voice, "the telephone system of the United States was destroyed last night." And he looked down. Now, the room broke out in a hubbub because we knew damn well it wasn't true. For two reasons. First of all, a number of us had used the telephone that morning. But a more important reason, you can't destroy the telephone system in the United States. You know why? Because it's not a system. It's a network. See, the difference between a network and a system is a network doesn't have any essential parts. If you take Los Angeles to San Francisco, and cut all the wires between Los Angeles and San Francisco, you could still talk to San Francisco. How? Go through Sacramento or Denver or some other place. In a network, there are always alternative paths. There are no essential parts, but in the system there is. So if I take the motor out of the automobile, there's no way of getting around the motor. It won't run without a motor. So we said, what the hell's he talking about, you know? And the room was buzzing. And finally, because people realize that discretion is the better part of valor when your boss is involved, it quieted down, and he looked up. He glowered at the group. He said, I know what you were just saying. Some of you probably used the phone this morning, and some of you were arguing that there's no way of destroying the system, and so the system couldn't have been destroyed last night. Am I right? Well, everybody was greatly relieved because this shows he's in touch with reality. So they all, shook their heads like this, and then he started to tremble with rage, and he shouted, damn it, I told you the telephone system in the United States was destroyed last night, and you better believe it. Because if you don't, I'm going to fire you by noon. Well, he looked down again, and now the buzzing really did begin in the room. Because there's something dramatically and seriously wrong. But the decision was, let's get a little bit more data before we act. So he looked up the third time, and suddenly he stood up straight, his normal color came back, and he broke out in a great big belly laugh. And everybody in the room laughed with him. They didn't know what the hell they were laughing at, but the relief was so great, because clearly it was now a trick, that they laughed to get rid of the build-up in anxiety. When it quieted down, he now, in his perfectly normal voice, said to the group, what was that all about? He said, I'm going to tell you, but before I do, I want to make two things absolutely clear. Number one, the telephone system in the United States was destroyed last night, and you better believe it, because if you don't, by noon, I'm going to fire you. Now, why? He reached in his coat pocket and pulled out a sheet of paper that was folded, covered with handwriting. Held it up like this, and he said, in the last issue of the Scientific American, the journal written on science for the average person, there was a study reported that said that this laboratory, Bell Labs, is the best industrially based research and development laboratory in the world. And I believe that, he said. Is there anybody in the room who doesn't? Well, nobody raised their hand, obviously. He said, you see this? I decided to make a list of the major contributions we've made to the development of the telephone which have earned us this reputation. Before I share my list with you, he said, I want to get your opinion. What do you think are the major contributions we've made to the development of telephonic communication? Well, almost every hand in the room went up. He called on one fellow, and he yelled out, the dial. The vice president said, right, that's certainly one of the most important. When did we introduce the dial, he said, and somebody knew it was in the 1930s. He said, when did we invent it? And nobody knew. He waited, he said, well, it's not surprising, I didn't know either, but I did look it up before I came to this meeting. And he gave us a date which shocked us. It was before 1900. He said, all right, let's take another one. The second one thrown out was something I didn't know what they were talking about. Somebody said multiplexing. Well, it turns out that multiplexing is a way of sampling sound so you can send 6 telephone conversations across the same wire at the same time. It increased the capacity of AT&T by 600%, and he said, right, that's certainly one of the most important. When did we introduce it? Somebody knew. Between the 2 world wars. When did we invent it? Nobody knew. He said he looked that up too, and it was before 1900. He said, let's take one more. The third one thrown out was the coaxial cable that connected the United States and Britain. He said, right, you now got the same first 3 I've got. When did we build that cable? And somebody knew. It was 1882. He drew a line. He said, now, gentlemen, doesn't it strike you as odd? The 3 major contributions ever made by this laboratory to the development of the telephone were all made before anybody sitting in this room was born. What the hell have you been doing? He said. He said, I'll tell you what you've been doing, and it's not your fault. He said, what you've been doing is looking at the parts of the system taken separately and improving them. But you haven't improved the system one damn bit. You recognize that? That was my first exposure to the system principle. That you could be improving the parts and not affecting the system as a whole. He said, gentlemen, that's my fault, not yours. Our research strategy is wrong. We're trying to improve the whole by improving the parts. What we should be doing is redesigning the whole and designing the parts to fit the whole. So, gentlemen, the telephone system in the United States was destroyed last night. And you're going to spend the next year designing the system with which we would replace the existing system today. If we were free to replace it with any system we wanted, subject to only 2 minor constraints. He said, before I get to the constraints, let me explain. I want to know what we do right now, not 5 years or 10 years from now. He said, if you don't know what you would do right now, if you could do whatever you wanted to, how the hell can you know what you want to do 5 or 10 years from now? So I don't want to have to worry about that kind of forecasting. Right now, without constraints. Why? If you don't know what you would do if you do whatever you want to, how can you know what to do when you can't do whatever you want to? Well, we discussed that for a little bit, and he said, all right, what are the constraints? 1, the system you design must be technologically feasible. He said, I don't want any science fiction. That does not mean that you can't innovate, but all innovation must use knowledge currently available. And then he used some examples that I won't take you into for the interest in time. We discussed that for about an hour until it had been internalized in the group. He said, now the second requirement is the system you design must be operationally viable. That means that the system must be able to survive in the current environment if it came into existence. It does not mean it must be capable of coming into existence. And then he explained the difference. He said, I don't care whether we can implement the system or not. What I do care about is that if it were implemented, it would survive. It has to obey the law. If it's going to be a corporation with shareholders, it's going to have to obey the Securities and Exchange Commission. And he went through a series of requirements in order to survive in the current environment. And that got us to about 11:30 in the morning after some discussion. And he said, here's the way we're going to do it. He said, I'm going to break you up into 6 groups because this group is too large. There was about 40 people in the room. Each group will get a subsystem, and each group will select a representative. They will meet weekly. Because the rule is this, that any subgroup can do whatever it wants to do, providing it doesn't affect any other subgroup. But there's very little that any group will do that doesn't affect other groups. And so these weekly meetings will be a discussion of the interactions between the groups, because no group can do anything that affects another group unless the groups affected agree. Now, we discussed that for about 15 minutes until it was well understood. He said, now I want to be clear. He said, at the end of the year, I don't want 6 designs. I want to see one integrated design of the whole. He said, now, I'd like to break for lunch. It's about 10 minutes from now. He said, I'll use the latest developments in organization theory to set up the groups. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He said, you're the long line team. Now, long line is between city communication. The next 6 were the short line team. That's within city communication. The next 6 were the switching stations. And he finished the 5th team immediately with the fellow to my right. Then he said, the rest of you, which was myself plus 6 people from Bell Labs, will redesign the telephone set. There I was on a team, and I was on a team with my friend Pete Myers. The meeting was adjourned, and of course the teams immediately got together, and Peter introduced me to the other members of the group. They thought this was funny. How did this ringer get in? But they pointed out the VP hadn't precluded use of outsiders. So he said, I was welcome to attend the meetings if I wanted to. The net result was I spent more the next year at Bell Labs than I did back at Case, which was paying my salary. But what a learning experience it was, and I want to give you a sense of what happened. At our first meeting at 1:30 that afternoon after lunch in a small breakout room, had a table around which 7 of us sat. There was an easel and a pad, a telephone on a little table, and that was it. We said, where do we start? We have the telephone set to redesign. Somebody said, well, why don't we make a list of all the things that are wrong with the telephone, and then we can see if we can design a telephone that doesn't have those mistakes. Somebody else said, that's a terrible way to start. And we were a little shocked. We said, why? What's wrong with that? He said, because when you get rid of what you don't necessarily get what you do want. And then he gave some examples, which are obvious when you stop and think about it. If you turn on a television set, you're very unlikely to get a program you want. It's very easy to get rid of. Just turn the channel. But you're very likely to get a program you want even less. When we tried to get rid of alcoholism by prohibition, or the Volstead Act, we got organized crime, which was a lot worse than alcoholism. We tried to get rid of mosquitoes bearing yellow fever with DDT. We killed all kinds of other wildlife, which was much worse than what we got out of it. Unintended consequences. Therefore, he said, effective management cannot be directed against what you don't want. It must be directed at what you want. Now, an interesting thing about this, when I tell this to groups, the usual reaction is that our management worries mostly about what they want. I like somebody to say that, because then I will give you even odds that over 50% of your management's decisions are made against what they don't want. And I'm willing to give that bet to anybody sitting in this room about because management focuses on what's wrong, not on what's right. Okay? But when you get rid of what's wrong, you have a very good probability of getting something that's wronger. All right? So we said, okay, let's make a list of what we want the telephone to have. And we started. The first suggestion was no wrong numbers. Every call that you receive is intended for you. Now, we all agreed. Of course we want that. Second suggestion was very good. I happened to make it. I want to know who's calling before I answer the phone, so I don't have to answer the phone if I don't want to talk to them. Third suggestion, I want a phone I can use with no hands. Of course, why not? The fourth one was great. I did not make it. Somebody said, I don't want a phone that I have to go to. I want the phone to come to me no matter where I am. Of course. We went on for 3 weeks with 92 properties we wanted a telephone to have. Problem was, we hadn't designed the damn thing. All we had was a list of properties we want the telephone to have. So we ran dry after the 92nd property and said, what do we do now? Well, why don't we take the first item on our list, no wrong numbers, and see if we can design a phone in which you eliminate incorrect phone numbers. Now, at this point, I made a terrible personal mistake which temporarily destroyed my credibility in the group. I was teaching a course in logic at Case, so I pointed out that there are 2 kinds of wrong numbers. One is when you have the right number in your head and you dial it incorrectly. And the other is when you have the wrong number in your head and dial it correctly. And one of the groups said, yeah, but suppose you got the wrong number in your head, dial it incorrectly and get the right number. Well, fortunately, they decided that's very unlikely. That it was important to know how many of the wrong numbers are of each type. I was able to redeem myself because I knew the head of the psychology department at Bell Labs, Dr. Samuel Carlin. I called him on the phone. And after the amenities, I said, Sam, have you ever done any work on wrong numbers? And he exploded. It took about 5 minutes for him to calm down and me to get the answer. He had been doing research on wrong numbers for 17 years. I was the first one to ask him about it. He finally told me that 80% of the wrong numbers or the incorrect dialing of the right number in your head. So he said, okay, we're going to go after that. Now, I don't have a pad here where I can draw this, but I'm going to verbally give you the picture. In 30 minutes, we figured out how to do it. Think of a desk set of a telephone. Take the dial off the telephone. And in its place, you put something that did not exist in 1951, but which is ubiquitous today, a hand calculator. So on the face of the phone now, you have a register, 10 keys, one for each digit, and a red key in the corner. You come to this phone, you do not lift the receiver off the hook. You put the number in by pushing the buttons, and the number you put in shows in the register. Now remember, you got the right number in your head, right? So you look at the register. Is that the right number? If it is, you pick up the receiver and the whole number goes through at once. If it's wrong, you hit the red button in the corner, clear the phone, and redo it. Well, we were delighted with this idea. The trouble was we didn't know whether it was technologically feasible because the handheld calculator didn't exist. So we called a department of Bell Labs called micro-miniaturization and asked for help, and they sent 2 young men down. They were fresh out of MIT electronics, and they listened to us as we began to explain what we wanted to do and wound up whispering to each other. And pretty soon we're paying more attention to their internal conversation than to us. That rudeness didn't bother us particularly. You expect that in an R&D laboratory. But they got up and walked out suddenly with no explanation. And we were mad, but we weren't going to go after them. So we went on to something else. About 3 weeks later, they appeared and said, you probably wondered what happened to us the last time we were here. We told them that was the understatement of the month. And they said, we were very excited by what you were doing, but not for the reasons you were. So that wrong number stuff isn't very interesting, but those push buttons are. We went back, they said, and built a phone with push buttons. And we tested it on 2,000 people. They said, you know, it takes 12 seconds less to put 7 digits in a phone by pushing buttons than by turning a dial. In addition, if you don't have to lift the receiver when you do that, you're not occupying a phone line till after the number is in. Put the 2 times together that you save, and that's a 20% increase in the capacity of AT&T. So we have started a project over in engineering, they said, to develop that telephone. And we've given it a code name. And they looked around the room to make sure nobody was listening. And they told us the code name, Touchtone. That's where the Touchtone telephone came from. Now, every change that has occurred to the telephone since 1953 came out of that project, except 2, which I'll tell you about in a moment. Anybody got a handheld phone here? Mine's in the bag. If you hold it up, it's exactly what I just described. It's got a computer on the front side, right? You got each digit, and you got a clear button. You don't have a receiver to pick up, but when the number is in and it's right, what do? You press a button, which is lift the receiver up. It doesn't occupy the line until the number goes in. If it's the wrong number, what do? You hit a red button and clear it. There it is. There's the phone. In 1952, we built the first mobile phone. We didn't have satellites then, so it wasn't that kind of technology. The original phone was a radio broadcasting station, a tiny one. And the receiver was a radio, so it had a very limited range, and it wasn't very popular or very useful because of the limited range. But once the satellites became available, the whole technology changed, and this thing blossomed. The 2 things that we did not anticipate in 1951 were, first, pictures. We did not anticipate that, and then the internet. Those 2 changes came later. We had not guessed at those technologies. But every other change, call forwarding, automatic redialing, of course, it's a phone that comes to you. You don't go to the phone. It's with you wherever you go. There's a version of that phone that's not out in the market yet, but which exists, that hangs around your neck. And like this microphone, sits here and you can talk without the use of your hands. But more importantly, on the side, there are 5 buttons. So if I'm talking to Paris, as I did one day in the Pocono Mountains, and you call me, the first thing I do is look down and it tells me who's calling. I can send you 5 messages in my voice by pressing the right button. One will say, hold on, I'm busy right now, I'll be with you in a moment. The other one says, hang up, I'll call you as soon as I'm finished, and so on. There are 5 alternatives I have just by pressing a button. You can get that phone, and it costs $350, and so it's not commercially available yet. But the technology will ultimately be here. The phone is just going haywire today with all kinds of new developments. So this this process called idealized design has become the essence of systems thinking. It assumes that the existing system, but not its environment, was destroyed last night. It consists of that system. Let me go back. Its designers would have, if they could have any system they wanted, subject to 3 constraints. 2 I mentioned: technological feasibility, operational viability, and then 1 additional one. The telephone system is a mechanical system. It doesn't contain people. AT&T is an organization which contains people, and when you deal with an organization, it has to have an additional property. It has to be able to improve itself over time through experience, and therefore it must be able to learn and adapt. And this means that it's not utopian because it's capable of improvement. Utopia is always a statement of perfection. Now, the use of this process has 3 major effects on the organization that uses it. It simplifies the planning process by an order of magnitude by working backwards. See, all conventional planning starts with what's our current situation, where do we want to be 5 or 10 years from now, and how do we get from here to there? And that's the plan. So you have a vision of where you want to be out in the future, and the plan is the steps to take to get from here to there. But with idealized design, it's different in 2 important respects. First, it's where do you want to be right now, not out in the future. And then, how do I get from where I want to be back to where I am? Not how do I get from where I am to where I want to be. That sounds crazy, doesn't it? What this says is if you want to go from here to San Francisco and want to know the best way to go, you can get a map and chart each one of the different paths you can take to get there, and then pick the shortest one. And I'll tell you, that's stupid. The best way to find that out is get the shortest route from San Francisco back to Canoga Park. You say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Suppose I'm in San Francisco and want to go to Canoga Park. Are you telling me that I ought to get the best route back from Canoga Park to San Francisco? And I say, yeah. That doesn't make any sense. Why? How should finding the shortest route between 2 points depend on which point I'm at? But it does. And that was a great discovery in the 1950s by Richard Bellman at the University of Southern California. The principle is called dynamic programming. The interesting thing is children know it. They don't know, can't explain it. You ever watch a child solve a maze? How do they solve a maze? From the exit to the entrance. It's always easier than from the entrance to the exit. Now, why? Well, first let's take a very, very simple example. 64 players enter the Wimbledon tennis tournament. Okay? How many first-round matches will there have to be? 32, obviously. How many second-round matches?
16.
Next round.
8.
Next round.
4.
Next.
2.
Next.
1.
1. So you add up 32 plus 16 plus 8 plus 4 plus 2 plus 1. I can tell you, if you add them up, you get 63. Okay? Now, instead of starting at the beginning of the tournament, let's start at the end. The tournament's over. 64 players entered. How many losers did there have to be? No arithmetic. Now, if you want to see the advantage, suppose 57 players enter the tournament. Now, how many first round matches? You don't know. Because you got to calculate. What you got to do is you're going to have to give passes, or what's called a bye, to a certain number of players who will not have to play in the first round, so that that number plus the number of winners in the first round turn out to be a power of 2. That's tricky, but not if I work backwards. If 57 players enter the tournament, how many matches are there going to have to be? 56, because there have to be 56 losers. When you work backwards, the number of alternatives you have to consider is significantly reduced. For example, one problem I once had as a kid given to me is a farmer's going to market with a bushel of apples and meets his first friend, gives him half of his bushel plus half an apple. Second friend gives him half the remaining apples plus half an apple. Third friend, half the remaining apples plus half an apple. Fourth friend, same thing, has none left. How many did he start with? Well, we did it the conventional way, started with X apples, subtract from that what he gave the first friend. 1/2 X plus 1/2. So X minus 1/2 X plus 1/2 is what he had left for the second friend. Gave him 1/2 of that, and you developed this very long equation. It's not complicated, just long. Took us about an hour to solve it, and when we had the solution, we gave it to the older brother who had given us the problem. And he laughed. We said, "What's the matter? We get it wrong?" He said, "No, you got it right." Then what's so funny about it? He said, "The stupid way you did it." How can it be stupid if we got the right answer? He said, "Look, stupid, suppose you start with the last friend. When I reached you, I gave you half of the remaining apples plus half an apple and had nothing left. How many did I have when I reached you?" 1. It's the only possible number. Because half of 1 is a half, plus a half is 1, and 1 from 1 is 0. Now, I couldn't have had less than 2 when I reached you. But it can't be 2, because half of 2 is 1, plus a half is 1.5, and 1.5 from 2 is not 1. So by a marvelous leap of mathematical intuition, let's try 3. Half of 3 is 1.5, plus a half is 2, and 2 from 3 is 1. So I had 3. It can't be 6 for the same reason it couldn't be 2. So let's try 7. Half of 7 is 3.5, plus a half is 4, and 4 from 7 is 3. How many did I have to start with? Boy, you're strong in arithmetic. Multiply by 2 and add 1. How many did I start with? 15. Half of 15 is 7.5, plus a half is 8, and 8 from 7, 8 from 15 is 7, right? 4 from 7 is 3, 2 from 3 is 1, 1 from 1 is 0. It takes 1 minute to do that problem backwards and an hour to do it frontwards. Why? When I started frontwards, I start with X. How many values can X take on? Any positive integer. How many positive integers are there? Now, you certainly must know the answer to that question. How many positive integers are there? Infinite, right. When I started backwards, how many different numbers could satisfy his condition? 1. The difference between infinity and 1 is very large. And that's why working backwards is so strong. So this is one of the advantages of having an idealized design, is you plan backwards from the design to where you are. It completely changes your idea of what is feasible. I'll give you a very simple example. I knew a housewife who every morning in England to go shopping stopped at Marks and Spencer's, the biggest retail chain in England, to cash a check. And with that cash, she went shopping for her cooking for the day. In those days, the British didn't have refrigerators. One day she went to Marks and Spencer's to cash a check, and they told her that they no longer would cash checks. They had a new policy. And she was furious because her bank was 4 blocks away. And she didn't want to walk 8 blocks to get the money to do shopping. So she stopped to think. She said, in effect, I can't get the cash I want from where I am because the bank won't give it to me. But she said, where does the bank hand out money? Where does the store hand out money? And she could identify one place where the store hands out money. So she went downstairs and bought a dress. And she paid for it by check. She took the packaged dress to the return department, turned it back, and got a cash refund. You see, starting from the other end, where they hand out cash, she could figure out how to get it. But starting from where she is looking out, there was no way of seeing how to get the money. They had a policy of no check cash. And finally, this process enhances creativity because it's the essence of creativity to engage in an idealized design. Every creative act involves 3 steps. The identification of a self-imposed constraint, which prevents you from seeing alternatives that are possible, the removal of that constraint, and the exploration of its absence. Every creative act does that. That's why when you learn the solution to a puzzle, you always go through an aha experience. See, a puzzle is a problem you can't solve because of something you incorrectly assume. But the moment you see what the assumption is and remove it, you can see the solution. And so you always see that the reason you couldn't solve the problem is not the problem, but you. And what happens when you're playing backwards from an idealized design is you recognize that the principal obstruction between you and where you want to be is you. And it's because you normally have constraints that you impose by making assumptions which are false. And every puzzle is a problem that you can't solve because of something you incorrectly assume. And the same is true in planning. You say, that can't be done. That's nonsense. It's only because you're making assumptions. I'll give you a very simple example. I happens to come to mind. In 1951, I spent 6 months at the U.S. Bureau of the Census as a consultant, and my wife, who was then a fresh wife, was with me for those 6 months. And together with another couple, newlyweds, we went to Hogate's restaurant one night, which is the big seafood restaurant in Washington, D.C., on the river. And when we got there, the receptionist would not allow us in because both women were wearing pantsuits. And in those days, believe it or not, pantsuits were considered to be indecent. But we weren't aware of this. And so he said, you just have to go someplace else. But the 2 women said to us, wait, you just stay here in the lobby. And they disappeared. They went to the women's room and took their pants off, came back, and we were allowed in the restaurant. Because the upper part of the pantsuit was a tunic, which is the same as a mini dress. And they allowed mini dresses, but not pants. Now, we never would have thought about that. But you see, they saw an assumption that was being incorrectly made by the restaurant. And so we finally ate there with mini skirts and no pants. So this process then simplifies the design. It changes your concept of what's feasible, and it allows all kinds of creativity to get in. Now we have a few minutes left. I'm sorry we don't have more, but let's take any questions you've got about anything that came up during the morning.
Your last point, you said in a creative process, you have a constraint, you remove the constraint, and
Explore the consequences.
explore the consequences of the removal.
I'll give you an example. When Picasso was a young man, he lived in a garret in one room. He did all of his painting there. He had a local girl who migrated from the farm come in one morning a week to clean his place. He was a slob. And he was painting away one day when she was cleaning around the room, and he looked at her and said, "Boy, she's got a marvelous face. I would like to do a painting of her full face." So he asked her if she would come and sit for him at no fee, but she was flattered and said, "Sure." So at the appropriate time she came, and he set up a chair, put the easel in front, sat her down and looked at her and said, "Oh God, her face is marvelous." And then he got his paints ready and he recognized he had forgotten a turpentine. So he had to go to the closet to get the turpentine. When he got to the closet, he turned around and saw her in profile. He said, "Oh boy, her profile is wonderful. I'd like to do her profile too, but I got to do one or the other." "Why?" "Because I can see either the profile or the full face. I can't see them both." "Wait a minute," he said. He ran upstairs and went to one of his neighbors who he knew had these full-length mirrors, that stand freestanding. He brought two of them down and located them in such a way that he could see her both ways, full face and in profile simultaneously. But then by moving the mirrors, he made the profile fall on top of the full face. And then he did his most famous painting, a woman looking at herself in the mirror. It's an abstract, but it's a woman with a profile and full face on top of each other. You see, he broke a self-imposed constraint. And it's a very creative painting. Okay. Any other questions?
When we began on the essential parts,
I'm sorry?
we started talking about the essential parts satisfying three conditions. We talked about each part can affect the behavior or properties of the whole was the first one.
Right.
And then no part has an independent effect on the whole.
Right.
The third one is every subset can affect the behavior or properties of the whole, and none have independent effect on the whole. Can we talk about that a bit?
That no part has an independent...
Every subset can affect the behavior
Oh.
or properties of the whole, but none can have an independent effect on the whole.
Yeah. Well, it's easiest to see in an automobile. The motor's part of what's called the drivetrain. The motor, the shaft that connects the motor to the transmission and the axle to the wheel are all part of what's called the drivetrain. That system clearly affects the whole. But if the fuel pump isn't working, that system won't work, because it requires combustion in the motor, which is one part of the subsystem, right? If it doesn't have any fuel, you won't have the explosion that drives the piston that makes the motor drive the shaft that moves the transmission. So it depends on the fuel pump. But the fuel pump requires a signal from the battery to operate. It can't operate if the battery is dead.
So it can't independently affect.
Yeah. So that any one essential part can stop the system, but no one essential part can start it. There's another way of saying that condition. The essential parts are necessary but not sufficient unless you take them collectively. The essential parts collectively are sufficient for the function of the whole. But separately, they're only necessary, not sufficient. Okay? So a motor can't drive an automobile by itself, but it can't be driven without a motor. Okay?
And that's
Yeah.
why you can't take the Rolls-Royce engine and put it in the Hyundai and have it work, because the fuel system and everything else
Doesn't fit
influence
it.
the
Yeah.
motor.
That kind of engine requires a certain kind of fuel input, as you well know. I mean, you don't have an awful lot of interchangeable parts on those two things. It doesn't mean that you couldn't have, but right now they don't have. Okay? All right, you had a question.
If the old system continues to reward the behavior that's expected and or accustomed, how is it then that managers are going to understand the need to know the new way of thinking? There's no support system there.
Until they understand systems thinking, your rewards and your incentives are all wrong. Because currently the incentives are all directed at improving the performance of the parts taken separately. You get rewarded on how well your part did. So each division of the company is. separately. So you take Walmart stores with, I don't know, 12,000 stores. Every manager of stores rewarded on how his store does. No consideration is given how his store interacts with other stores to create an inventory problem at the warehouse, kind of thing. We have to change the compensation system. Among other things, there are two major changes that have to be made in corporations when you start to think systemically. I only mention them. I don't have time to go into them here. One is that today, 95% of the people employed in the United States can do their jobs better than their bosses can. And therefore, you no longer can supervise subordinates. So, job descriptions should be eliminated. People ought to be brought in, told where they're going to be in the organization, and then they define their work. Why? Because studies have shown that only 23% of what people know that's relevant to their jobs are they allowed to use by job descriptions. They restrict the use of knowledge, and you want to eliminate that restriction. Second fundamental change is that salary has to be eliminated as a function of status. The silent rule in most organizations, nobody can be paid more than his boss, right? There's no rule that says that, but just stop and think. That's the way they all work. I'll bet you none of you in this room are getting a higher salary than your bosses. But that's the way it works. That rule has to be eliminated. Okay? We discovered when we were doing work for General Electric Lamp Division that one salesman was selling $42 million worth of electric bulbs a year. He was selling them to railroads. We changed the incentive system. He was making more money than the CEO, for good reason. The company could do without the CEO much easier than it could do without that salesman. Now, there are places in government, particularly in research and development, where you pay for competence and not for status. One of the most interesting projects I ever had was at Xerox. The Xerox machine was developed by a company that had a total of 30 employees. Did you know that? A little tiny company. The Xerox machine was an instantaneous success. It grew like mad. And the first thing they did was build a building for research and development and employed 300 people. 3 years later, they had not a single innovation. And so we were brought in as, why haven't we had a single innovation? So we asked who were the ones that developed the first Xerox machine. And they told us who they were. They were all now managers. And we went to interview them. They were all unhappy because they wanted to be back on the laboratory table. We said, well, why aren't you? They said, well, because we couldn't afford it. Our salaries would go down. So we changed the salary structure of Xerox and took all of those people who had developed the first Xerox machine, took them out of management, brought them back into the laboratory. In 6 months, they had the color Xerox and the desktop Xerox. In 6 months. See? The salary system is preventing creativity. It's not looked at systemically. Okay, I guess we're out of time. People seem to be anxious to have a seat, so let's eat.